Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here at the Deusto International Tuning Academy at Bilbao. I'd like to thank the Tuning Academy and also my own university, Universidade de Brasília, and the law school for allowing me the period to be here. My talk will be about Brazilian legal education and the competence-based learning approach, general perspectives. The presentation is premised on the principle that change in teaching and learning methodologies are linked to social transformations. In this sense, higher education serves the purpose of forming citizens apt to participate in the public sphere and contribute to the advance of the learning communities and professional activities. We mean to emphasize that education for competences may constitute a methodological option as well as a pedagogical philosophy that seeks to explore and educate students to understand their social role and become capable in their professional functions with excellence and be able to engage themselves in continual education. Finally, we will act to demonstrate the pertinence of education for competences to the field of legal education, based on an analysis of a Brazilian experience and the struggle of an academic professional community in favor of new pedagogical projects that attend the plural necessities of their own society. We start with legal education in Brazil, the origins and constraints of the pioneering field in higher education at the country. We organized this talk in 6 topics that reach from legal education Brazil, the origins and constraints of the pioneering field in higher education, to the law school at the University of Brasilia, and the experience of bringing students to a better place in the pedagogical place. Before we start, we'll take a very quick look at Brazilian population, because this is going to be an important topic along my talk. We need to remember that Brazilian population, it's now very polarized in 2 major groups, the white population and the black population, and a few indigenous groups that 5 centuries ago were around 5 million people. There are some indicators of the OECD that seeks the population, education, GDP, unemployment, income inequality, and some of those figures. They are important to understand my talk, because I assume that legal education is also part of the major context of a certain region. And those indicators are here to offer some context to you. And the population pyramid also demonstrates still very young population, and a population that's and consequently very interested in higher education. And also we need to take into account the teaching profession. Brazilian has one of the youngest teaching workforces in the world. And those figures are here for you to appreciate them at any time of your own interest. And also, just to make it clear, I have some pillars of Brazilian political development, because it's important to take into account that before this year of the beginning of the colonial period and the Portuguese rule, we had already mentioned a population of 5 million indigenous in Brazil. They lived in a completely different environment, but the political country as we know it, in the modern concept of the state, it starts here in 1500. This is just for persons not familiar with the Brazilian political situation to take in account. Oh well, now let's take a look in legal education in Brazil, the origins and constraints of the pioneering field in higher education at the country. Higher education in Brazil was quite late in being developed in comparison with other Latin American states. It begins only in 1827. Two law schools were established by the first Brazilian emperor as part of the policies of the state building shortly after independence for Portugal. The pedagogical model adopted in the education was the so-called Coimbra model from the University of Coimbra. That model, that time, followed the assumption that all instruction must be based on the knowledge of the teacher. Exams were taken on the basis of memorizing what the professor said during the course in very long lectures. The libraries were poor and natural law was the basis of all analysis. The faculty was nominated by the emperor. Some changes began at the end of the 19th century, where natural law being replaced by positivism as a theoretical basis in the study of law. However, nothing really changed related to the teaching and learning methods. The historical basis of the Brazilian law and judicial process, the Romano-Germanic theoretical perspective, is reflected by the strict observation of the codes. The state is seen only as the only source for law, and the lectures at the lectures, professors will in most cases just make narrow comments about what the codes had established as a rule. No analysis related to the tensions between the law and the society will ever be offered. By the middle of the 20th century, there were only a few law schools at the existing universities, despite of the immensity of Brazilian territory. They were mainly devoted to educate what a famous author had identified as the aprendizes do poder, or the apprentices to power, an educational system and environment where the Brazilian elite would send their sons and daughters to learn about the administration of the state, to build networks of political influence and learn how to acquire and maintain power. Social, economic, and cultural inequalities were not reflected in law schools, where the professors and students were members of the same elites dominating the country. Questions of social oppression resulting from more than 3 centuries of benefiting from African slavery and the violent and bloody dispute over indigenous lands remained outside of legal education. Legal education was characterized by an adherence to models determined by the state dedicated to maintaining social and economic control. The curriculum was focusing on the codes. There was hardly any understanding of the context of the law, and there was no comprehension of the social, economic, or cultural demands of the society. Now we go to second point of my presentation, the challenge and change of Brazilian higher education since 1988, universities and the mission at the federal constitutional level. Legal education had been seriously affected by the dictatorship in Brazil that lasted from 1964 to 1985. Professors had been banned to teach and do research. Among them were two ministers acting at the Supreme Court. One of them was the dean at the Institute for Social Science at the University of Brasilia, Victor Nunes Leal. For 2 decades, students were taught under the oppressive regime and the rules of the authoritarian bureaucratic state that denies political freedom and its structure to maintain a large intervention in all spheres of life. With the freedom provided by the new constitution in 1988, a national movement started for the democratization of Brazilian education and the recognition of its social objective. Universities were called upon to open new areas of research and embrace what by the 90s were called standards of quality. better faculty training at the MA and PhD levels, better infrastructure and curricular change to emphasize social necessities. Universities were seen as sanctuaries for the production of knowledge and debate on national problems and policies, a process which were interrupted in the 60s by the military dictatorship. Article 6 of the 1988 Constitution stipulated a number of social rights, among those the right to education. The Constitutional Assembly had provided a subjective right to education. Citizens could demand it from their state. Free access was made obligatory and free at the basic level, ages 4 to 17. Public higher education, although tuition-free, was selective in that Article 208 had foreseen that access depended on the capacities of each individual. Public and private entities coexist in higher education as they do at the fundamental level, Article 209, leaving private institutions to be regulated by the state, Article 9. The Constitution also guaranteed the didactic, scientific, administrative, and financial and patrimonial autonomy of the universities, obliging them uphold the principle of the unity of teaching, research, and service, Article 207. It's this principle of autonomy that serves as the basis for great change in the profile of students in the 21st century. A conclusion for the period is that higher education became an important aspect of Brazilian public policies. In the first decade after the end of the dictatorship and ahead, the debates of how enlarge access to this level of formal education is already a major concern for policymakers and the society. And I'll go to number 3, topic number 3 of our presentation. The transition to democracy also led to changes in legal education. A movement emerged in the early 90s, which brought together law school faculties, the Brazilian Bar Association, and the Ministry of Education in an attempt with an interdisciplinary perspective to challenge the previous concept of what a curriculum is and should provide. The changes included obligatory legal practice and the offering of more optional courses. The so-called complementary activities ensured that up to 10% of the 2,300 obligatory credit hours have been completed freely by the students. Students were also to guaranteed access to teaching, research, and extension activities during the 5-year undergraduate program. Thus, juridical education started to resemble the principles of higher education in general. As of September 2004, a new curricular directive of law courses went into effect at the state level. For the first time, competences and abilities became objectives in law education, although it's still restrained by a technical and professional, a conservative professional outlook. These are Article 4 of the directive. The undergraduate course in law must make possible a professional formation that reviews at minimum for following abilities and competencies. Reading, number 1, reading, comprehension, and elaboration of texts, juridical or normative acts and documents with the proper utilization of technical juridical norms. Interpretation and application of the law. Research and utilization of legislation, jurisprudence, doctrine, and other sources of law. Adequate technical juridical activity in different instances, administrative or judicial, with the proper utilization of processes, acts, and procedures. Correct utilization of juridical terminology, of the science of law. Utilization of juridical reasoning, argumentation, persuasion, and critical reflection, judgment and decision-making, and domination of technologies and methods for the permanent comprehension and application of the law. However, this new regulation for legal education entered into force at a time at an unimaginable expansion of new law programs uh, at Brazilian educational institutions. By 1995, there were a total of 235 law programs in operation in Brazil. And at this slide, you can see the astonishing enlargement of numbers. Those are staggering numbers. And also, we can see that the majority of enrollment for students lasts in private higher education institutions. It's by the 90s, in the middle of the 90s, it started the enlargement of private schools in a dynamic no one could ever imagine. But in spite of a limited perspective about what competence should be, it was indeed positive, its appearance at the directive. And now we start with point 4 of our presentation. The federal system of higher education, the impact of new policies of inclusiveness on law education. Higher education in Brazil, like at other levels, must obey to a complex and sophisticated system of legal provisions which define, for example, from the curricular structure of each program to the policies and measures for evaluating and ranking postgraduate programs. There is an enormous effort by government and the academic community aimed at establishing and adapting public policies in education. The state regulates via legislation and constitutional norms the entire system of teaching, research, extension work in the country. There's a detailed system for the authorization, credentialing, and evaluating programs at the federal and state levels. This system defines career structure and expectations and rests upon another system of selection and entry for higher education. This latent system affects education at all levels, since all basic education has become content-driven and tied to the annual university entrance exams. But the greatest transformation in Brazilian higher education during the first decade of the 21st century was initiated at two state public institutions. In 1997, only, I would say, less than 2% of incoming students at the federal public universities were of color, in spite of the fact that more than 50% of the Brazilian population describes itself as a person of color. So, uh, so on November 9, 2001, there was a law implemented in the State University of Rio de Janeiro upon initiative of the state legislature that established a new law that instituted a minimum quota up to 40% for persons of color in all undergraduate programs at state universities. In 2004, the University of Brasilia also implanted a quota system for 20% of all undergraduate programs. The adoption of this measure was followed by other federal universities to take similar actions. But also there had been a strong conservative political reaction leading to a series of legal battles aimed at extinguishing all affirmative action policies. There was a claim of non-compliance with fundamental precept, ação de descumprimento de preceito fundamental, ADPF 186, and direct unconstitutionality action, ação direta de inconstitucionalidade, against the quotas established. These constitutional challenges were judged and rejected by the Supreme Court of Brazil in 2012. The court unanimously supported the maintenance of quotas at all public universities. The court decision provided incentive for the federal government to issue Law 12,711 on August 29, 2002, instituting a national policy of quotas at all federal universities. 50% of all slots were to be guaranteed to students from public schools and those from lower income families. This decree created a wave of new student diversity, altering the structure of Brazilian higher education completely. One can say, without exaggerating, that the policies for affirmative action taken initially by the universities themselves and just after a few years intensified by the federal government changed forever the environment of higher education in Brazil. It's a unique experience and in its essence transformed the public universities in the only space in the country where polarized social classes are experienced daily life side by side. And now I go to part 5 of my explanation. Tuning and legal education. What are the perspectives? Brazil participated in Tuning Alpha Latin America in 2 phases. Phase 1 encompassed an year 2005 to 2007. The prospect that pedagogical process should be student-centered, that the construction and consolidation of competences should form the basis for this process, and that education should become a lifelong learning process for the student were in line with the tendencies of Brazilian higher education at that time and the changes occurring in the profiles of the students and faculty. Since the year 2000, the expansion of undergraduate education has a strong link with postgraduate programs in law. The postgraduate education in Brazil in law was significantly developed with 34 doctoral programs, 98 academic masters, and 5 professional masters. This implied the emergence of a new generation of academics familiar with research methodologies. However, at the same time, this development did almost completely ignore the field of legal education and the methodologies of teaching, learning, and evaluating. Some attempts had been made since at least a decade at centers dedicated to excellence in juridical formation to change that. These centers are devoted to exploring active methodologies for teaching and learning in the so-called participative methodologies that transform the roles of students and professors in the educative process. Observing this movement, one discerns a growing interest in the discussion and understanding of a system of learning based on competences. In spite of the growing interest of professors and students in getting to know and implement competence-based education, there are considerable obstacles. For example, there are severe methodological and practical challenges for a traditional faculty. Following the competence-based learning, a faculty must embrace collective work. The Brazilian tradition, however, is one in which the professor at a law school is usually placed in 2 situations which run counter to collective work. First, in institutions of the federal system, the professor generally works in an isolated and individual manner, in the best scenario with the postgraduate students, and through perspectives which restrict them to their particular course offering and academic specialization. In this model, the student is conceived as a passive and historical subject who must complete only the cognitive dimension of the range of competences. Second, there is similar situation of the professor at private institutions where the lesson plans and institutional projects are limited by a general common standard that practically makes methodological innovation impossible. This is the general state of affairs, but there are projects foretell a more creative direction and posit the student at the center of learning. Among these, we will highlight the law school at the University of Brasilia. On July 9, 2012, the Council of the Law at the University of Brasilia approved a new pedagogical project that brought significant alterations in the students' formation. The project was supported by two pillars: education for competences and the obligation that teaching learning evaluation activities must coexist with research, university service, and juridical practice. The elaborators of the project were a large number of professors from the law school, as well as the Institute for Social Science and the Institute for Political Science, the later two active in the postgraduate programs, and the systematic inclusion of students from the academic centers. In Brazil, we have all faculties. We have representatives from the academic, from the students' body, and it was wonderful to work with them. The working methodology took into account some of the practices collected by the coordinator of the group who had participated in the project Alpha Tuning. Among these, we must emphasize that teamwork is the foundation of all the dynamics applied in the constructors of this pedagogical project. Professors and students worked in autonomous groups and also as a common whole. During the phases integrating the activities of students and professors, we emphasize the selection of general and specific competencies to be developed in the different obligatory and optional courses. The structuring principles of the project were defined thus. Juridical education as a process of the formation of academic professional competences over the course of the program. Integration of teaching, research, and extension activities as the organizing principle of the pedagogical structure. Student autonomy and responsibility in the formative process. Diversity of theoretical and methodological approach. And this is very important to our faculty. This is a very strong value for Faculdade de Direito at the Universidade de Brasília. Process of teaching learning tied to the mutual responsibility of professors and the students in reaching desired objectives. Essential connection between theory and practice during the entire formative processes. The project, it's important to say that this project was developed simultaneously with the discussions of policy of inclusion in the Brazilian public universities. Indeed, the project was approved only one month after the only 1 month before the presidential decree that reserved 50 of placements for quota students. With Universidade de Brasília joining the National Exam for Middle Education, ENEM, and the Unified Selection System, the SISU, in which students across the nation may compete for university entrance, we could expect significant change in profile of our student body. What had happened? The entry of students selected in the processes as of 2013 has produced a new student body profile at the law school, which previously had been the exclusive dominion had been almost the exclusive dominion of the sons of the state elite of the capital, except for the 20% of Afro-descendant Scottish students since 2004. We had a very homogeneous group of students before 2004. I'm at Faculdade de Direito at the Universidade de Brasília since 1999, 2009, and it's amazing the change in the profile of the student body. One might say, without risk of exaggeration, that the University of Brasília Law School had been from 1961, when it started, until 2012, an almost permanent symbol of the elitist and the exclusionary nature of Brazilian legal education. As the only black member of the Supreme Court declared in his vote on the affirmative action challenges, Ministro Joaquim Barbosa. All of us know the elitist nature and fundamentally exclusion of our educational system. If we can, if we can call it a system that until a short time ago was reserved for a small group of the anointed. Student diversity can only be fully exercised and not silenced, buried, or suffocated within a system of teaching learning where the student is active subject in the process. Education for competence is first a necessity for a project of a democratic inclusion that's also epistemological and methodological. The university transforms itself in an environment which nurtures the development of essential competence for a professional career that goes beyond the simple application of juridical rules. And with this, it recognizes and values the diversity, plurality of the student body, a reflection of society itself. Now I must conclude with saying that the change in the profile of students of legal education at the federal public universities that condense the majority of the professors working full-time as legal faculty brings a challenge to adopt and explore new pedagogical perspectives based on the assumption that the diversity at the student's body is a rich opportunity to better understand the current challenges at Brazilian society. So far, the changes are not yet noticeable. We can witness some initiatives related to research groups dealing with themes of racism, police violence towards the black population, human rights and its legal and sociological perspectives, women's rights, and the need to be a more equal society, among many others. We must acknowledge that research is a fruitful area for building competencies related to critical thinking and analysis. But we should not ignore that the majority of the mandatory credits in legal studies are related, yet, to classical discipline, such as property and family law, criminal law, procedural law, and at the very heart of legal education is located the possibility to change mindset based yet on how much the professor knows. That professors master the field of teaching is a presumption at good legal schools. But learning is not about what and how much the professor knows. It's about how much the students can build in itself a connection to a given knowledge and how she or he can explore this capacity in connection with previous experience, values, and future goals. When dealing with competences at the pedagogical level, the professor is forced, or better saying, motivated to make an attempt to understand the student, his or her potential, but also difficulties, and to plan the pedagogical goals on the purpose of offering the most effective conditions to fully develop the competences of the student. At the institutional level, a lot of change is also certainly necessary also to transform competencies as the basis of the learning process. It's useful to recognize that along with the professor proper academic facilities, it's also a right of the student, just to mention a very basic aspect for the educational processes. Legal schools have to become finally also effective competencies building environments. The road for competence, the road for competences-based learning approach is certainly long and no doubt hard to pursue. But when we think about how much good energies, both from gifted professors and well-motivated students, are just lost in so many decades of just wrong assumptions about how people learn, create and work, the motivation is just around the corner. Thank you.
Thank you very much.